The Clark family had always been close-knit, bound together by a deep love and mutual respect. Jennifer Clark, a devoted wife and mother, had married Marcus Clark in her early 20s. They had a daughter, Lily, who was the light of their lives. Marcus was a hard-working man, employed on an offshore oil platform, a job that often kept him away from home for weeks or even months at a time. Despite the long absences, he remained a loving father and husband, always making time for his family whenever he was home. However, the family's happiness was shattered by an unexpected and devastating tragedy. One fateful day, a violent storm swept through the region where Marcus's oil platform was located. The storm was ferocious, with towering waves and hurricane-force winds battering the platform. Despite the extreme conditions, Marcus and his crew continued their work, knowing the risks involved. In the chaos of the storm, a fellow worker was caught in a life-threatening situation, and Marcus, ever the hero, rushed to his aid without hesitation. In the end, Marcus's bravery cost him his life. He managed to save his comrade, but in doing so, he was swept overboard by a massive wave. The search for him lasted hours, but it was ultimately in vain. Marcus was lost to the sea, leaving his family behind to grapple with the unimaginable loss. Jennifer was inconsolable when she received the news. The love of her life, her partner, and the father of her child was gone forever. The days that followed were a blur of grief, funeral arrangements, and the numbing shock of his absence. Lily, too, was devastated. At just 16 years old, she had lost the most important person in her life. She fell into a deep depression, struggling to understand how someone so strong and vital could be taken from her so suddenly. Despite the overwhelming grief, Jennifer knew she had to be strong for Lily. She tried to keep their lives as normal as possible, maintaining their daily routines and encouraging Lily to keep up with her schoolwork. But nothing could fill the void that Marcus had left behind. The loss was too profound, and the wounds too deep. 2 years passed, but the pain never truly went away. Jennifer and Lily had learned to live with the loss, but it was always there, lurking in the background. Jennifer threw herself into work, trying to keep busy and distract herself from the aching loneliness. She maintained the house, cared for Lily, and tried to move forward, but she couldn't shake the feeling that a part of her had died with Marcus. Lily, now 18, was still struggling with depression. She had managed to finish high school and had been accepted into a prestigious college to study psychology, hoping to understand her own pain and help others who were suffering. But the shadow of her father's death still loomed large over her life. She missed him every day, and the thought of moving away from home, leaving behind the place where she felt closest to him, was almost too much to bear. Nearly 2 years had passed since Marcus's tragic death, and while Jennifer Clark had done her best to maintain a semblance of normalcy, the loneliness that had settled into her life was undeniable. The nights were the hardest. The house felt unbearably quiet without Marcus's steady presence, and the silence seemed to echo the emptiness she felt inside. Jennifer was a strong woman, but the weight of her grief was heavy, and it was only natural that, over time, she began to yearn for companionship again. It was during this period of emotional vulnerability that Jennifer met Donald Thompson. They crossed paths at a charity event held by the local church. Jennifer had attended more out of a sense of obligation than anything else, but the evening took an unexpected turn when she was introduced to Donald, a man who seemed to radiate confidence and charm. Donald was 41, just a few years older than Jennifer, and he was everything she hadn't realized she was missing. He was successful, intelligent, and carried himself with a quiet authority that was instantly appealing. From the moment they met, there was a spark between them. Donald was the kind of man who knew how to make a woman feel special, and he immediately took an interest in Jennifer. He listened to her, asked thoughtful questions, and made her laugh, something she hadn't done much of in the last 2 years. For the first time since Marcus's death, Jennifer felt a flicker of happiness, a glimmer of hope that perhaps she could find love again. Their relationship developed quickly. Donald was attentive and caring, the kind of man who brought flowers just because, who called in the middle of the day to ask how she was doing, and who made her feel like she was the center of his world. He seemed almost too good to be true, and for a while, Jennifer allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had been given a second chance at happiness. However, there was one complication. Jennifer knew how much her daughter was still grieving the loss of her father, and the thought of introducing her to a new man filled her with anxiety. Lily had always been close to Marcus, and Jennifer worried that the idea of her mother moving on might be too much for her to handle. So, for the first 6 months of their relationship, Jennifer kept Donald a secret from her daughter. They continued to see each other in private, meeting for dinners, going on weekend getaways, and spending quiet evenings at Donald's place. Donald, for his part, was understanding about Jennifer's decision to keep their relationship under wraps. He assured her that he was willing to wait until she felt the time was right to tell Lily, and Jennifer was grateful for his patience. But as their relationship deepened, Jennifer began to feel the weight of her secrecy. She loved her daughter and hated keeping something so significant from her. The guilt gnawed at her, especially during the rare moments she spent with Lily, who was now away at college. Every phone call and visit was tinged with the unspoken truth that Jennifer was hiding. She knew it wasn't fair to Lily, but she also knew that her daughter was fragile, and she didn't want to do anything to cause her more pain. Still, the longer Jennifer and Donald were together, the more serious their relationship became. Donald started to hint at wanting to take things to the next level, and Jennifer knew she couldn't keep their relationship a secret forever. She needed to tell Lily, but the thought of how her daughter might react filled her with dread. She worried that Lily would see it as a betrayal, that she would feel as though her mother was trying to replace Marcus. The last thing Jennifer wanted was to hurt Lily, but she also knew she couldn't keep Donald a secret indefinitely. As the 6-month mark of their relationship approached, Jennifer made the difficult decision to tell Lily the truth. It was a conversation she had been dreading, but she knew it was necessary. She loved Donald and wanted to be with him, but she also loved her daughter and didn't want to lose her. It was a delicate balance, and Jennifer could only hope that Lily would understand. Lily had been away at college for nearly a year now, studying psychology at a prestigious university in a neighboring city. It was a significant achievement, one that Marcus would have been incredibly proud of. But while Lily excelled academically, Jennifer knew that her daughter was still wrestling with the deep grief of losing her father. The calls home were frequent but brief, and Jennifer could sense the distance that had grown between them. She had hoped that college would provide a fresh start for Lily, a way to move forward, but the shadow of Marcus's death lingered over her like a cloud. Her hands trembled slightly, and her heart pounded in her chest. When Lily answered, Jennifer hesitated, carefully choosing her words. She gently informed her daughter about the relationship with Donald, explaining that they had been together for about 6 months. The silence that followed was excruciating for Jennifer. She could almost feel Lily processing the information, and she braced herself for an outburst of anger or disappointment. But when Lily finally responded, her tone was calm, though somewhat distant. She acknowledged her mother's right to be happy and made it clear that she didn't intend to judge her. However, there was an underlying sense of unease, a reminder that the memory of Marcus was still very much alive in their lives. Jennifer felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew this was only the beginning. Lily's response was mature, but it also highlighted the complexity of the situation. Lily was still dealing with her own grief, and the idea of her mother moving on with another man was something she would need time to accept. Jennifer reassured her daughter that Marcus would never be forgotten, emphasizing that her love for him remained unchanged. As the conversation ended, Jennifer reflected on how much Lily had grown. Her daughter had handled the news with a level of maturity that surprised Jennifer, though she knew there was still a long road ahead. Donald would eventually meet Lily, and they would all have to navigate the new dynamics of their family. But for now, Jennifer was content that she had been honest with her daughter. Winter arrived, bringing with it the familiar chill and the sense of family that comes with the holiday season. For the first time since leaving for college, Lily was coming home, and Jennifer was eager to see her daughter. The house, once filled with warmth and memories of Marcus, had taken on a different atmosphere since Donald's presence became more permanent. Jennifer had done her best to make things as comfortable as possible for Lily's return, But there was an underlying tension, one that she couldn't quite shake. Donald, sensing her arrival, stood up and turned to greet her. He was a tall, well-dressed man with a confident air, someone who commanded attention without even trying. But to Lily, he was just an unwelcome intruder. They exchanged brief introductions, Donald trying to be as cordial as possible. But Lily's response was cold and distant. She quickly excused herself and retreated to her room, leaving Donald and Jennifer to exchange uneasy glances. Over the next week, Lily did her best to avoid Donald. She made sure to spend time with her mother when he wasn't around and kept herself locked away in her room when he was. Jennifer noticed the tension but didn't push the issue, understanding that this was an incredibly difficult adjustment for Lily. She knew that her daughter needed time to process everything, and she hoped that with patience, Lily would eventually come around. One evening, she decided to talk to Lily, hoping to bridge the gap. She knocked on Lily's door and entered the room, finding her daughter sitting on the bed, lost in thought. Jennifer sat down beside her and gently broke the news that Donald had proposed to her. It was a moment Jennifer had been both dreading and anticipating. She knew that Lily would likely be upset, and she wasn't wrong. The look on Lily's face was one of anger and disbelief. Jennifer could see the pain in her eyes, the hurt that her mother was moving on with someone else, someone who wasn't Marcus. But to Jennifer's surprise, Lily didn't lash out. Instead, she took a deep breath and nodded, her expression a mixture of resignation and sadness. Lily understood that her reaction was rooted in her own grief and trauma. She knew that her mother had a right to happiness, even if it was with someone she didn't like. But that didn't make the news any easier to accept. The thought of Donald becoming her stepfather weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. As spring approached, Jennifer and Donald got married in a small, intimate ceremony. Lily attended, but her heart wasn't in it. She felt like a stranger in her own family, watching as her mother exchanged vows with a man she could barely stand. The image of Donald standing next to her mother, smiling and happy, was a painful reminder of everything she had lost. After the wedding, Jennifer invited Lily to spend the spring holidays at home. Lily hesitated, not wanting to be around Donald more than necessary, but she agreed out of a sense of duty to her mother. When she arrived home, she was dismayed to find that Donald had moved into their house permanently. He had his own place, but Jennifer had insisted they live in her home, surrounded by the memories of Marcus, where she felt more at ease. This decision only deepened Lily's resentment. Lily, now a tall and fit young woman from years of playing tennis, found herself in a situation she couldn't escape. Donald, now her stepfather, seemed determined to establish some kind of relationship with her. He was always friendly, always trying to engage her in conversation, but something about the way he looked at her made her skin crawl. There was a strange intensity in his gaze, something that Lily couldn't quite put her finger on that made her deeply uncomfortable. As the days passed, Lily's discomfort around Donald only deepened. What had initially been a vague sense of unease grew into something more intense, more alarming. Every time she was around him, she felt his eyes on her, lingering just a bit too long, following her every move. She was a sensitive person, always had been, and she trusted her instincts. Something about the way Donald looked at her was wrong, deeply, unsettlingly wrong. Lily was tall and athletic, her years of playing tennis giving her a strong, graceful figure. She knew she was attractive, but she never thought of herself that way. Yet it became impossible to ignore the way Donald's eyes would trace her body when he thought she wasn't looking. He would watch her as she moved around the house, his gaze heavy and invasive, making her skin crawl. It wasn't just her imagination. She could feel it, the way his attention shifted whenever she entered the room, the way his eyes would flicker with something dark and unsettling. It started with small things, glances that lingered too long, smiles that felt too intimate. But soon, it escalated. She'd find him in places where she didn't expect him to be, like standing in the hallway when she was coming out of the shower or appearing behind her when she was cooking in the kitchen. He'd offer to help with tasks she didn't need help with, always finding excuses to be near her. Each time, she would politely decline, trying to keep her distance, but it was clear he wasn't getting the message, or maybe he didn't care. The unease grew into dread when Jennifer announced that she would have to leave town for a few days. Her mother had fallen ill and was in the hospital in a neighboring state, and Jennifer wanted to be by her side. Lily's heart sank at the news. The idea of being alone in the house with Donald terrified her, but she didn't want to worry her mother, who already had enough on her plate. She nodded and forced a smile, telling Jennifer that she would be fine, even though every fiber of her being was screaming otherwise. The day Jennifer left, Lily woke up early, her anxiety already gnawing at her. She tried to shake it off, telling herself she was overreacting, that Donald wouldn't do anything. But the fear was there, persistent and unyielding. She stayed in her room as long as possible, hoping to avoid him, but eventually, hunger forced her out. Dressed in her pajamas, she made her way to the kitchen, only to freeze when she saw Donald sitting at the table, eating breakfast. He looked up and smiled at her, that same smile that never reached his eyes, and she felt her stomach turn. Without saying a word, she quickly turned around and retreated back to her room, her heart pounding in her chest. She locked the door behind her, pressing her back against it, as if she could somehow keep the fear out. As the afternoon turned into evening, the dread became unbearable. She felt trapped, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. All her friends were away at their universities, and the idea of calling her mother to confess her fears seemed both futile and selfish. Jennifer was already stressed about her own mother, and Lily didn't want to add to her burden. In a moment of panic, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She quietly slipped out of her room and made her way to the kitchen, moving as silently as possible. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Lily quickly opened a drawer and grabbed a kitchen knife, her hands trembling as she clutched the handle. It wasn't much, but it gave her a small sense of security. She hurried back to her room, locking the door behind her once more and sliding the knife under her pillow. It was a desperate act, but it made her feel slightly safer. As the hours crawled by, her unease turned into a sense of impending doom. She knew Donald was still in the house, moving around somewhere in the background like a predator biding its time. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional thud or creak that reminded her she wasn't alone. Each time she heard a noise, she would freeze, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to listen, praying that he wouldn't come near her. But Donald was relentless. It wasn't long before Lily heard the all-too-familiar sound of his footsteps approaching her room. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear rising to a crescendo as the footsteps drew closer. She didn't want to believe he would actually come to her room, but the reality of the situation was undeniable. There was no one else in the house, no one to protect her. She was completely vulnerable, and Donald knew it. Her mind raced, desperate for a plan, an escape. She couldn't call for help. Her phone was on the other side of the room, and even if she did manage to get to it, what would she say? Who would believe her before it was too late? The only option left was to protect herself, and that's when she remembered the knife she had hidden under her pillow earlier in the day. It wasn't much, but it was something, a last resort, if things went horribly wrong. The thought of having to use the knife terrified her, but the idea of Donald getting what he wanted was even worse. She needed to stay calm, to think clearly, but it was nearly impossible with the sound of his footsteps echoing in her ears. The doorknob rattled slightly, and Lily tensed, gripping the edges of the blanket she had pulled around herself. Then, just as she feared, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, almost too gentle, as if Donald was trying not to scare her, but the knock alone was enough to send her heart into a frenzy. She knew she couldn't ignore it. He wouldn't go away. With trembling hands, she pushed herself off the bed and walked to the door, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. She hesitated for a moment, then opened the door just a crack. Donald stood there, his expression a mixture of concern and something darker. He apologized for bothering her, his voice smooth and measured, as if he were addressing a scared child. He explained that he just wanted to get to know her better, to bond with her in Jennifer's absence. His tone was warm, almost affectionate, but there was an undercurrent that made Lily's skin crawl. She could sense his intentions were far from innocent, but what could she do? Lily didn't want to let him in, but she couldn't think of a valid reason to refuse without making the situation worse. She knew she had to be careful, that any sudden moves or outright rejection could provoke him. So, reluctantly, she opened the door wider and stepped aside, allowing him into her room. The air seemed to grow heavier as he crossed the threshold, his presence filling the small space in a way that made her feel cornered. Donald sat down on the edge of her bed, gesturing for her to join him. She did so, keeping a safe distance, her body rigid with tension. She tried to steer the conversation to safe topics, discussing her schoolwork and future plans, but Donald was disinterested. He kept his focus on her, his eyes never leaving her face, his smile just a little too forced. The room felt stifling, the walls closing in as she struggled to maintain her composure. When she finally hinted that she needed to work on her homework and that it was getting late, Donald didn't seem to notice or care. Instead, he offered to help her with it, his voice dripping with false sincerity. Lily shook her head, politely declining, but before she could pull away, he reached out and placed his hand on her leg. The touch was light at first, but it lingered, sending a shiver of dread down her spine. Her entire body tensed, her instincts screaming at her to get away. But she was paralyzed by fear. Donald's hand began to move, slowly sliding up her leg in a way that made her stomach churn. His other hand reached out to stroke her hair, his fingers running through it in a way that was far too intimate. The room seemed to spin around her as she realized that her worst fears were coming true. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The weight of the situation bore down on her, trapping her in place as Donald continued his slow, deliberate advances. She was caught in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape. The storm that had been brewing for so long had finally arrived, and there was no one to save her. Donald leaned in closer, his hand still on her leg, and whispered something she didn't catch. Something meant to reassure her, to ease her resistance, but it had the opposite effect. The fear inside her turned to pure terror, and she knew she had to do something, anything, to get away from him. Her mind flashed to the knife under her pillow, the only thing she had to defend herself. But could she really use it? Could she really stab someone, even in self-defense? She didn't know, but the decision was rapidly being taken out of her hands. Donald's hand slid further up her leg, his fingers tightening slightly as if testing her reaction. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound echoing in her ears, drowning out every rational thought. She was frozen, trapped in her own body, unable to fully process the horror unfolding before her. As Donald's hand slid higher, his fingers digging into her skin with increasing pressure, his other hand moved to her hair, stroking it with a disturbing gentleness. Lily's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, but the fear had taken hold of her, paralyzing her. She felt like she was suffocating, the walls of her room closing in on her, the air thick with tension, and the stench of Donald's cologne. She could barely whisper, her voice shaking as she tried to confront him. But before she could fully comprehend what was happening, Donald shifted, his body looming over her, and his grip tightened as he moved closer. With one swift motion, he grabbed her waist, yanking her towards him and pinning her down on the bed. Panic surged through Lily, her instincts screaming at her to fight, to scream. But when she opened her mouth to protest, Donald quickly clamped his hand over it, silencing her. Her eyes widened in terror as she realized what he intended to do. Donald's weight pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. His hand, large and rough, covered her mouth, muffling her cries, while his other hand roamed over her body with a sickening familiarity. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He was going to rape her, and there was nothing to stop him. Lily struggled beneath him, trying to push him off, but Donald was far too strong. His body pinned her down with ease, her attempts at resistance only seeming to fuel his aggression. Tears streamed down her face as she realized how helpless she truly was. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, but then, amidst the chaos in her mind, a single thought emerged: she had to survive. Donald's hands were relentless, pulling at her clothes, trying to strip away the last barrier between them. In her desperation, Lily's mind flashed back to the knife she had hidden under her pillow. It was her only chance, her last resort. Her heart pounded with renewed fear as she realized she might have to use it. With Donald distracted, his hands focused on removing her pajama pants, Lily began to inch her hand towards the pillow. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the cool metal of the knife's handle. She hesitated, her mind racing with the gravity of what she was about to do. Could she actually stab him? Could she really kill someone? But the alternative was unthinkable. The horror of what Donald was about to do to her was far worse than the thought of using the knife. She had to protect herself, no matter what. With a surge of adrenaline, Lily wrapped her fingers around the knife's handle and pulled it out from under the pillow. Donald was too focused on his own actions to notice what she was doing. He was too consumed by his own sick desires, his breath heavy and erratic, as he leaned down to kiss her neck. The feel of his lips on her skin made Lily's stomach churn, but it also solidified her resolve. She had to do this. She had no other choice. With a quick, decisive movement, Lily brought the knife up, aiming for Donald's neck. Her hand shook, but she forced herself to be steady. She could feel the cold steel in her grip, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Donald didn't notice until it was too late. The knife plunged into his neck with a sickening squelch, the blade sinking deep into his flesh. Blood spurted out, warm and sticky, spraying across Lily's chest and face. Donald's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening in a silent scream as he reached up to grasp the knife's handle. But it was too late. The damage was done. Donald staggered back, pulling away from her as he clutched at his neck, blood pouring between his fingers. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one gurgling with blood as he choked and spluttered. Lily watched in horror as he stumbled, his body jerking with spasms as he tried to stay upright. But the wound was too severe. Donald collapsed onto the floor, his body convulsing as his life drained away. The room filled with the sound of his labored breathing, the gurgling of blood in his throat as he struggled to speak, to say something, but the words never came. His eyes were wide with fear, with disbelief, as he stared up at Lily. Lily remained frozen on the bed. The terror, the panic, the adrenaline, it all came crashing down on her at once, and she broke down in sobs, her body shaking uncontrollably. Lily's thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one thing stood out above all else. She needed her mother. She needed to tell her what had happened, needed to hear her voice, to know that she wasn't alone in this nightmare. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone, dialing her mother's number with trembling fingers. When Jennifer answered, Lily could barely form the words. Her voice cracked with fear and desperation as she tried to explain what had happened. "I killed him," she sobbed into the phone, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I killed him, Mom. He tried to. He was going to. Oh God, I killed him." Jennifer's voice was distant, filled with concern and confusion as she tried to calm her daughter, but Lily could hardly hear her. The room spun around her, the reality of what she had done crashing down on her like a tidal wave. She had killed Donald. She had killed her stepmother. And now nothing would ever be the same again. Lily was hysterical for several minutes and could not say exactly what happened. She kept repeating to her mother on the phone that she killed, that he was pestering her. She told him to leave, but he did not listen. After a while, the mother hung up. After 3 minutes, flashing lights were heard. The police and an ambulance arrived and quickly burst into the house. Having unhooked the perimeter, they quickly took Lily to the ambulance. A few minutes later, Lily, having taken a sedative, saw 2 paramedics leave the room, and forensics entered. Donald was dead. Lily was taken to the police. Her mother arrived 2 hours later, getting off at the first stop. Arriving at the police station, the mother was horrified. Officer Johnson took it upon himself to explain what he had managed to find out. According to Lily's testimony, he attacked her and tried to have sex with her. Lily tried to resist and break free, but it was all in vain, after which she stabbed him right in the neck trying to protect herself. A day later, the lab tests came back, which proved that Lily had not hit Donald just like that. Lily's biomaterial from hair, skin, and most importantly, from the mucous membranes were found under his nails. The investigation established that Donald really tried to abuse Lily. The mother could not believe it. Her husband, the man she loved, turned out to be a real scumbag. Even if he had survived, he would have been dead to her. Despite all her love, his actions were unforgivable. The court found Lily guilty of exceeding self-defense measures, but assessed her actions as adequate to the current situation. Lily was sentenced to 6 months of house arrest with the obligation to undergo therapy and regularly undergo examinations for her adequacy. After 6 months of arrest, the judge concluded that she no longer deserved it, and Lily's conviction was expunged. Jennifer decided to sell this house and move to forget all the nightmares they had to endure. Lily supported this decision. She transferred to another equally prestigious college in a neighboring state, and her mother Jennifer has a difficult path ahead, a difficult path to realizing whether she can still be happy as a woman.